Interested in learning how to create VR experiences for arcades and LBEs? Then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, an immersive technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Vivian Tan, a game, content, and VR developer with over 10 years of experience. She is the founder of Beast Pets, an experience for VR arcades and LBEs. Vivian, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, Marcelo. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. We met a long time ago. I think it was at VR LA the first time we met. You were exhibiting there your Beast Pets experience.
Yeah, I definitely remember that.
Today we're going to be chatting about how to create VR experiences for LBEs and arcades. But before we do that, why don't you just give us a little bit more about your background? How did you get into VR? What kind of content did you create?
So my VR journey started a long time ago. I actually was creating for virtual worlds out in the mid-2000s. This was long before I ever put on a VR headset and just access the world through your traditional 2D screen. But I was creating content in Second Life. I built one of the first hit fashion brands in there. And that's what really got me into the, possibility of experiencing this whole other reality through virtual worlds. And actually gave me the inspiration for building Beast Pets because I had a little Chow Chow in there, a little dog. And she was so sweet, and then she would accompany me while I was hanging out in the world. And that led me to think, as technology progressed, what else could we do with virtual pets?
So how did you get into VR itself? As a user?
As a user, I think there were two main experiences that shaped how I enter VR. The first time was when I tried the Oculus DK1 after it first launched following the Kickstarter campaign. As you know, the experience was limited, but it was a game changer. I remember getting really lightheaded and kind of nauseous, and that made me really sad because I was thinking at the time, it's like, oh man, I'm born to do VR, but I can't even put on the headset. How am I going to go about this? But then that changed in only a few short years. Like VR hardware progressed far faster than I thought it would. And I was really pleasantly surprised in 2016 when I tried on the HTC Vive and realized I had zero motion sickness. I was thoroughly immersed and just having the time of my life. I think I got a short 5-minute demo during a hackathon. And as soon as I pulled off the headset, I'm like, VR's here. I'm doing VR.
So what was your first experience? Do you remember?
I think it was robot repair from the lab.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
I loved it.
And how did you decide to jump into being a creator itself, like starting to create experiences?
I was already transitioning from my previous startup where we created 3D math games for kids in elementary and middle school. So I was already a content creator at the time. So the big leap for me at the time was shifting how I thought about spatial experiences, more like getting into the VR world rather than content creation itself. And initially I thought making the switch would be easy because I already made 3D content. It wasn't until I really started developing for virtual reality experience through a headset rather than experience through a 2D monitor that I realized, simply translating 3D content from the screen to VR isn't enough. You really have to experience and understand the spatial relationship between users and interactive objects and the environment. And it changes everything.
Right. Because a lot of people are bringing in sort of a 2D experience into VR, right? And that just doesn't work. You as a user are now the content itself as well, right? So it's kind of a different way of thinking when you're doing VR.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it wasn't until I put on a VR headset and started experiencing different types of games and content while being spatially immersed in the experience did I realize how much of an impact it has on you as a viewer. And for me personally, it was the horror games that really brought that home. Like when a zombie jumps out behind you rather than just at you on a screen. That made a world of difference to me. And that got me to start thinking about like what it's like being inside the scenario, being inside the environment versus just looking at it from the screen.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened to me where when I first tried it, and for example, I tried Tilt Brush, I was just drawing flat because in my mind, it was still kind of like a 2D flat screen until I realized I can walk around my drawing, I can draw all around me, and all of a sudden I started understanding the Z-axis, right? And that's what VR is all about, is that Z-axis. We've been so accustomed to X and Y only in flat gaming and just computing in general for 40 years now, that getting into VR, we still continue that. And then you realize, oh my God, we have the Z-axis and we can do whatever we want. We're free now.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it, being that the fact that our brains are so wired to navigating the X and Y space, we forget about the Z axis. And for me, what was funny was that even though my first VR experience where I truly got into it was in the HTC Vive, which afforded a 6 degree of freedom experience, I was accidentally limiting myself to 3DOF. When I was in Tilt Brush, I was drawing in a sphere all around myself. And I think whoever was demoing it to me was like, Vivian, you can walk around. Try walking around.
When you decided to start developing for VR, what made you choose to focus more on LBEs and arcades? And we'll go into what all that means for those people that don't understand what LBEs are. But what made you focus that versus the end consumer at home?
So our case is a bit unique, I think. So our startup, Beast Inc., we are bringing virtual pets to life through artificial intelligence, XR, and a bit of magic. And by XR, I mean all the technologies along the continuum of AR to VR. And one of the reasons why we went for LBEs and arcades first was because we wanted to build pets that can form a meaningful relationship with players. So we wanted to go much deeper with the technology and give them the spatial intelligence and social and emotional intelligence. So what that also meant was that we did not have the bandwidth to create a lot of more traditional linear gameplay content because we were focusing our energies on creating smarter pets and building up their ability to form bonds with a player. So given that trade-off, we realized that we weren't really ready to go after the home market yet because the player expectations there would be a bit different, that you would most likely want hours and hours of gameplay. But in arcades, the typical play experience is much shorter. So it's possible to have a very compelling 10 to 15 minute experience when you're playing VR in arcades. And we realized that sort of limited time frame for the initial experience suited us well because then we can really focus on how players were interacting with the pets and how the pets were responding to players and responding to each other versus having to make hours and hours of content. So that was a big deciding factor in going after arcades first. The second deciding factor for us was that we wanted to reach a wider audience because we're building this family-friendly content, and we realized a lot of our target players who might be very new to VR, who might be curious about VR, but don't want to invest $1,000 to $2,000 on a high-end rig at home yet. These are the people who are trying VR out for the first time in arcades, and we wanted to be able to bring our pets to them. So given these multiple factors that weighed in favor of going after arcades first, we decided to pour our resources into optimizing our pets and our initial VR experience for arcades and LBEs rather than releasing in homes. You
wanted to bring it to a wider audience through LBEs and arcades. Question for you then, and this is a question that really came up in my mind because of what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, we had tons of arcades, right? But then the 90s, the desktop computing started getting more powerful. Games were coming to the desktop, and slowly arcades started, dying off. When VR is adopted, with a wider audience at home, and the technology gets to a point where, for example, the Oculus Quest, right, that allows you to walk around freely now. What do you think is going to happen to VR arcades and LBEs?
I think VR arcades and LBEs will evolve. They have been, actually. And you raise a really interesting question. It's something I discuss frequently with other developers and also those working directly in the arcade and the LBE space, such as operators and distributors. And that initially, I think, when VR arcades started emerging along with the current VR wave, I'd say 12 to 18 months ago. At first, myself included, and some operators were approaching this as sort of a stopgap solution until home VR took off. But incredibly, with all the amazing entrepreneurs working in the arcade and LBE space, it's become much more than that. It's become much more than just, hey, let's bridge this gap between, early adopters buying expensive headsets to everyone having home VR, and then waiting for arcades to die out like it did in the 70s and 80s and 90s. That's no longer the case. LBEs have evolved into its own industry and into its own form of entertainment. And it's really, really innovative. So, for instance, like what arena scale or warehouse scale arcades is something I don't think I personally anticipated when I started getting into the space, right? This mapping of the real world environment to the virtual experience. This is something you can't do at home.
A la Void, right?
Yeah, like the Void, that grand scale. But even if we look at LBEs or arcades that exist on a smaller scale, that's not this big warehouse that you can walk around in, there's still a lot of innovation that's going on there that makes it going to an arcade with your friends a really unique experience you can't quite experience at home. So for instance, I don't think there's an industry term that's quite emerged yet, but we sometimes call it local multiplayer, where you can play in groups with your friends at a same location across maybe 4 or 5 stations and headsets. That's an experience you can't quite replicate at home, because even if home VR takes off, right, it's most likely a shared device. Like a console or TV, you might have 1 or 2 devices at home, but you're not going to have 4 or 5 to play with your friends. And there's this group dynamic that it's far more enjoyable to do a lot of these social location-based experiences with friends. And it's a very different experience if you're interacting with friends through virtual reality than if you're hanging out together. And I think that's where arcades bring a lot of value. This group outing, this social experience that you can enjoy with your friends or family, and you can't quite replicate that at home. So due to the social nature of that, I think there's LBEs and arcades will always have a place in this industry, and it's not just going to fade out as home VR becomes more prominent.
Let's define real quick for the audience members that don't know the difference. Let's define LBEs, which is location-based entertainment. What's the difference between LBEs and VR arcades?
For me personally, I tend to use both terms interchangeably when I'm talking about the industry as a whole. But if I'm looking at like a more nuanced difference between individual businesses, I tend to think of LBEs as the larger operations, like the warehouse and arena scale experiences, like the Void, or generally when the VR experience is tied more closely to its physical surroundings. I tend to think of that as location-based entertainment. And when I think of arcades, I think of more individual booths and headsets that don't necessarily employ the physical surroundings as much. But overall, I frequently just use both terms interchangeably.
Right, and I agree with you. I think that's the difference that I find as well, is one is more of a bigger entertainment encompassing various things, including a bigger space, and then obviously you have mapping of the real world with the virtual world. The other one is usually just a headset that you can have at home. So Considering the future that possibly the arcades, the ones that just have a headset, right? Not the ones that give you that full experience, but just have headsets. Those ultimately may end up going away as people have headsets at home and they try it out. Considering those things, do you think developers, when they're creating experiences, should they be looking at holistically, not just LBEs and arcades, but also how can you also bring that experience to the home? Maybe it's the same experience, maybe it's a different experience that ties it with the LBE. What's your thought on that?
I think it really depends on the developer and the content. There are definitely types of experiences that work better in a location-based center than it would at home. At the same time, I think you raise a good point. It's like, are there strategies that ties both home and LBE content together? And I'd say that's definitely a yes. So for us, we started with the LBE experience, but we also want to bring a more personalized home experience in the near future. So for instance, the differentiator there would be our LBE experience is likened to going to a dog park, but instead of playing with dogs, you're playing with 5 baby dragons in this park. And we designed it that way because it is a very public experience. You go to an LB or an arcade, and then you play with the dragons there. They're not your dragons, but it's just like visiting the dog park. You're probably playing with somebody else's dog. For the home version, we want the context and the content to align. So when we're designing for the home version, we're thinking about it like more along the lines that this is your personal pet and this is more about your relationship with a pet. And in the future, this will tie back into the LBE experience where if you're playing with, instead of just playing with, the dragons you find in the park, you should be able to bring your own dragon with you, even if you're playing with an LBE. So this is an example of how the home and the LBE experience can complement one another. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I do think context helps set a lot of expectations for what type of content could be experienced and really reinforces that immersion and magic when you're inside the VR experience. So for developers looking to approach both the LBE and the home space, tweaking the content or coming up with a slightly different narrative that suits the public space and the home space could really reinforce that immersion.
What about designing experiences that incorporate multi-device support? And let me explain what I mean by that. When you go to an LBE, right, it's not just the person playing, but you also have your friends that are not playing with you, possibly. Some of them may be spectating. Some of them may have an iPhone or an iPad. What about developing an experience where you combine all of these devices so it does become truly social, whether you're in VR or you're outside of VR? Helping your friend in VR. Have you guys looked at anything like that? Or do you know of anybody doing things like that?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. It's something we've been calling spectator mode. We experimented some with that, as in like, can you peek into what your friends are doing instead of seeing them kind of wave about in space and then seeing a 2D rendering of their screen on a monitor. We experimented with like, well, can you hold up your phone or iPad, right, and see like this mixed reality render of the world they're seeing, and then maybe take pictures and stuff like that. Earlier this year and last year, I think there were several startups and also content developers experimenting with that sort of spectator experience. And so for us personally, we kind of dropped the project because we haven't really found a good use case just yet. To my knowledge, and I can't speak for all developers, but just based on what we've observed, I think it's been trending more towards like a more cooperative experience where everyone's in VR versus trying to come up with like a halfway experience for people who are spectating using their phones.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think would be kind of cool is to not only be a spectator but be able to play the game with your friend, but you have tasks to do using your, let's say, your iPhone or your iPad while they're in VR. So that way everybody could be involved and not just spectate, but also be part of the game without having to be in VR. So sort of a multi-device kind of experience.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. At OC5, they announced casting to the phones that would make that sort of interaction much easier.
Right. And they were kind of doing that at OC5 with Dead and Buried.
Oh, yeah. I saw that.
Right. Where they have the iPads and people can follow. And yeah, so it's that kind of involvement. And maybe that's part of something that developers need to look at and holistically understand all the devices and how can an experience harness all those devices. Because, we all have that device in our pocket, and instead of sitting there and watching the person play, why not be able to be part of that play, but not have to be in VR?
And I think having native support makes a huge difference. One of the reasons why we didn't continue pursuing the spectator mode was because, one, we're a small team. We only had so many resources to dedicate to different experiments, and lacking native support and having to work with a lot of different, building a lot of different technologies from scratch made that barrier much higher for building a compelling spectator mode or spectator engagement with the VR content. But having native support from, say, Oculus, that is a big game changer, lowers the bar drastically for adding things for spectators to do through their phones or through their iPads.
So when you're designing a game for LBE, you have two customers, right? One is the person playing, but then the other one is the arcade operator, the one that's going to have to manage this. So how do you design a game that it's truly fun to play, but yet easy to install and maintain for arcade operators? Because I'm thinking you have to think about these things as a developer, right?
Definitely. And this is something we always tell other developers if they were to approach us and ask us, about how we design or optimize our content for arcades, is to remind them that they are serving two sets of customers, the arcade operators and the end users. Fortunately, I don't think you really need to make a lot of drastic changes. You just need to keep in mind, how can I make life easier for arcade operators? And the few things we recommend is always include a short onboarding experience inside your content. It doesn't have to be long. The shorter, the better. Just something to give players a quick refresher on how the controller is mapped to your game. Just enough hand-holding to get them started on their own without the operator having to talk them through everything. So a lot of arcades will implement some type of tutorial themselves, either something they built in-house or software that they're licensing through an arcade content platform, for instance. But to my knowledge, most arcades will have some sort of built-in onboarding experience. But because everyone's content is unique and controller schemes are slightly different, we recommend just putting a quick refresher in there so then operators don't have to explain every time a player goes into a different experience how to use it.
Right. So this would be kind of like a lot of games do that today to onboard you on how the mechanics of moving around are, how to shoot, whatever the game is, right, at the home level. But you got more time at home to take, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes to try out the mechanics and be onboarded, where you don't have that time in an LBE because that whole experience for the game itself is going to be 15, 20 minutes, right?
Exactly.
So what strategy should a developer use when creating this onboarding experience? Because obviously they've got, 1-2 minutes, I would think.
Yeah. So that time frame in which you have to capture the user's interest is far shorter when they're in an arcade environment. Because if a user gets frustrated, they'll likely just switch to a different experience. And also, because most arcades charge maybe per 30-minute or 60-minute sessions, so you're kind of on the clock there. You want the user to kind of get over that learning curve as fast as possible. So in our case, because our experience itself is about 10 to 15 minutes, and we are also anticipating kids or people new to VR trying Beast Pets for the first time, we don't want to lose them or bore them during the tutorial. So what we did was that we made the tutorial part of the discoverable experience. In the Beast Pets arcade experience, you are meeting all of our dragons one at a time as you're discovering different types of magic and toys that you can utilize in this world. So we have 5 or 6 treasure chests, and you open each one of them up. In each one, you discover a new gem that grants you a power. So, for instance, the power of teleportation, or this magic sparkler that when you light it up, attracts the dragons. And after you open each chest, a dragon would appear and play with you. We designed the onboarding to be linear, as in you have to open each chest in order to progress to the next step. Then we realized that about partway through, people start getting really bored because they're in this beautiful sunny park. They want to move around and explore. And if you keep them on the rails too long, they will lose interest. So what we ended up doing is doing the first half of our onboarding and tutorial, the first 2-3 chests. We made that mandatory. These are the fundamental skills you need to acquire in order to move around and experience Beast Park. That's the name of our Dragon Park inside our VR experience. But once you discover the teleporter, we open up the experience. We make the rest of the chests and treasure chests and dragons discoverable rather than mandatory. So this gives users a sense of command over how they're supposed to interact with this world, but also a sense of freedom. They're no longer locked on rails. So translating something like this to a different type of a VR experience could also possibly work, where you would start out giving your users the fundamental tools, taking the first minute or two to make sure they really learn that, and then making everything else discoverable. So they feel like they have agency in this world. But meanwhile, you're still teaching them useful things about how to play the game and how to navigate without restricting them.
So really, the onboarding experience is part of the game itself without the user knowing that they're being onboarded right now.
Exactly. I would say a lot of the onboarding experience can be part of the game itself, but make sure you hit on the fundamentals in the very beginning.
Circling back to distributing your game to LBEs and arcades, how do you go about supporting this? So, for example, your game may go down for whatever reason. There may be some customer support issues like technology issues. The arcade operator may have questions about how do you install it. You know, as you expand your game to hundreds of arcades, do you have a support strategy that you set up prior to distributing this, and how are you going to support the arcade operator? And should developers be thinking about this as well?
Developers should definitely be thinking about this. So in our case, to date, we're in about 150 or more locations worldwide. And we're a very, very small team. We have 3 full-time people working on all this. So naturally, we don't have a dedicated support team for all of our LBE customers, but we do field, questions as they come in, and it's a full team effort. And we have pretty close relationships with a lot of people in LBEs. So what we learned, and was a useful distribution and support strategy for us, is to work closely with licensing and content platforms. So for instance, Springboard VR, Private Label, and Synthesis VR are 3 content platforms we work with. And the way this works is that we go through them to license content to LBEs. So they serve as a distributor and an intermediary. And this is really great because if a problem arises in an LBE, if the arcade operator knows us personally, they tend to just email us directly because we have that personal relationship. But as we are getting bigger and bigger, we don't expect to have personal relationships with like all 150 and more locations. But if a problem would arise, they can contact the distributor, and the distributor can contact us directly. And we can solve, for instance, any technical issues for tens or hundreds of arcades at once instead of having to deal with them one-on-one. And this makes it much easier for us to support a very large group of customers with such a small team. And so my recommendation there is that if developers were to want to cast a wide net but lack in-house resources, is to work really closely with a distributor and leverage that support network.
And I'm assuming you have like sort of a tiered support structure where the distributor can help out. You probably provide them an FAQ where they can help out like tier 1. And if it's beyond their knowledge, they can contact you, right? Or do they contact you for pretty much anything?
The tiered structure is how we approach it. We provide an FAQ, like you said. And so for basic things like how do you navigate a game and how do you get players started, that's information we provide as part of the game listing. So operators, without consulting us, can have access to like a quick start guide. So it makes it really easy for them to get up and running without even talking to the distributor. And the distributor knows us and the game content well enough so that they can provide the next level of support if needed. And it's only when like a more serious technical issue arises. For instance, sometimes there are conflicts with like developing to the beta branches or something. That's when they contact us.
Do you have a voice when you're telling the arcade how to set up your game? Because some of the experiences, like for example, the Void, I've done a couple at the Void, and your experience doesn't start when you put on your goggles or your HMD. Your experience starts when you walk into the place, right? And obviously the Void, it's all about that, you know, it's about 1 or 2 or 3 games. In an arcade, you'll have a lot more. But do you have a voice in saying how you're going to display my game? Also, if you want to do some multimedia prior to entering the game, or if you want to decorate how your game is going to be shown prior to that whole pre-game experience, do you have a voice in that? And should developers think about those things? How do you bring them into your world prior to even getting into the HMD?
I have several thoughts on this. First, I think it's something to bear in mind is the degrees of separation between the developer and the end user will affect how much say you have in the pre-VR experience, like you described. And someone once asked us, like, are you a B2B company now or a B2C? And I'm thinking, well, we go through several layers, right? We go through distributors. Then the content is brought to VR arcades where it's managed by the arcade owners and operators, and then it gets to the players. So that makes us now a B2B to B2C company. Given that many layers of separation, we don't really have, and this is our specific case, we don't really have a lot of say in how arcades present the game or present the context in which our VR beast pets are experienced. That said, we do have some indirect say in that, you know, like I was talking about earlier, we designed the context of the experience itself so that it's fitting for a public arcade environment, right? Like going to the Dragon Park, which is a public environment as well. So that's a bit of like indirect control over setting up the player's expectations of what they encounter within the VR experience. Another thing is that we also provide content for arcade operators in this marketing kit that we have linked to our website, in which they can find posters and other material that they can display in the arcades and help market the game and set up and give players something to interact with and view before they enter the VR experience itself. But that's our approach because we know that the way we're going about distributing our VR experience, we're several steps removed from the end player.
Well, what about dictating hardware requirements? So, for example, you need this particular HMD, you need this particular computer with this amount of power, right? Because when you're designing this, you're designing it for a particular hardware configuration, and you want to make sure that that's represented properly. So when people play your game, they're not frustrated by the speed of it or performance of it, right? So do you have a say in the hardware that your game, or do you believe developers should have a say in that, of where it's played and the minimum requirements to play it?
That really depends. I think you can set minimum hardware specs, but it also greatly limits your ability to be present across all LBEs. And I think this again comes back to the degrees of separation between you, the operators, and the players. So if you have a more direct relationship with operators, then you definitely can have more of a say in how you want your game to be set up, minimum specs, and how you want everything to be experienced. Backtracking a little bit on this topic, because I talked about our experience, which is several steps removed from the end player. But I also know other developers, for instance, the team that created Where Thoughts Go. It's a VR experience in which you can record your own thoughts and listen to other people's thoughts, and it's all stored in this beautiful VR world. They are present in a couple of LBEs, but they work directly with LBEs, and in some locations, they even set up like this cool blanket fort, and you can crawl into it before putting on the HMD and entering this immersive world. So that's a very different relationship than what we have with developers, in that it's a direct relationship, so they can create this entire ambient setting to fully immerse the player. So when it comes down to the physical setting or hardware specs, etc., I think it really just all comes down to how many degrees removed are you from the arcades and from the players. But on a more fundamental, you can set hardware specs. And I mean, if you're distributing directly to operators in arcades or through a distributor, you can say it's like, oh, I need this type of minimum spec in order to run this game. But at the same time, I think that creates a lot more friction for arcades.
Right. And you're limited to your audience.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Vivian, we're pretty much out of time. I have 380,000 more questions for you, but we're not going to get to them today, unfortunately. I wanted to ask you about the Oculus Quest. You went to OC5. I was there too. I tried the Oculus Quest. It was an incredible experience. But I'm wondering, what's your thought on the Quest itself and how it will affect LBEs? Or will it affect LBEs, and will you be developing for that platform?
Yes, we'll definitely be developing for the Oculus Quest, and I think it's going to be great for LBEs. Having this untethered experience means that it opens the possibility for even smaller developers to pursue an experience that would more closely tie the virtual experience together with the physical surroundings. So we were already our team and other developers were already shooting the breeze on what's possible, what type of walkthrough experiences you can create with a Quest, because you now have this mobility and freedom. You no longer need cumbersome backpacks and this complicated rig to create a very mobile experience in VR. So I think I'm really excited to see what developers come up with, in new LBE experiences using the Quest.
Have you looked into what it takes to port your experience into the Quest yet? Or they made it sound like, within a couple of weeks. I think the Superhot VR was ported in a couple of weeks, and they made it sound that it's not that hard. But have you guys looked into that at all yet?
Yeah, it's something we're starting to look into right now. We're chatting with the Oculus team to see how we can port our experience. Fortunately, we're lucky in that because we focus so deeply on building the pets themselves, and rather than rendering a really complicated environment, I think we'll probably have a pretty easy time porting to the Quest.
Well, that's good news.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited about that. And like I was talking about earlier, our vision is for everybody to be able to enjoy our pets in VR. So the Quest lowers that barrier to entry significantly for consumers that want a high-end VR experience. So we're really happy that we can, for instance, parents with little kids ask us, should I invest in a VR headset now? Now we can tell them, yes, go out and buy that $400 headset. You're going to love it. I
have one last question for you, which I ask all of my guests. What would you like VR to be 5 years from now? Not what you think it will be, but what would you, if you had the power to control this, what would you like it to be?
I would love for it to be an extension of ourselves, the same way that mobile phones are an extension of ourselves. It makes our world so much richer and bigger. And it's a place where we can really just unleash our imaginations. I want to be able to enter all the beautiful virtual worlds our people are building and experience just all these other layers of realities. And of course, I want our pets in there. I want them to be my adventure buddies as I'm going through VR.
You want your pets to take over the world, basically.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. World domination with beast pets. That's what we're after.
Well, I wish you best of luck with that. But thank you so much for being at the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Marcelo.
It was really fun speaking with you. If people want to get a hold of you or learn more about your company, do you want to give a URL, email, whatever you like?
So the best way to reach us is to shoot us an email to hello@beastpets.com.
Easy enough. Well, thanks again, Vivian. I appreciate it. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you like to watch video interviews and how-to tutorials all about immersive technologies, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at howtocreatevr.com/YouTube. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR and AR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, or MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.